Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Jay Barney, who is a professor at the University of Utah. Strategy, management, entrepreneurship, all that stuff. And also the author of a lot of books. Actually, the most recent book is called The Secret of Cultural Change. And I don't think we actually had a chance to discuss that the last time you were on the show. But of course, you also wrote this wonderful novel, which I assigned to all my students.
Oh, that's great.
So I'm responsible for a chunk of your sales. It's what I didn't learn in business school. And then, of course, you've got these wonderful textbooks, Strategic Management and Competitive Advantage, Gaining and Sustaining Competitive Advantage, and there's Organizational Economics, Resource-Based Theory. I used to actually use your textbook in my class back when students read textbooks, but they don't do that anymore. They barely read cases. I mean, I'm not even sure they read tweets anymore. But since this is the second time that I've had you on the show, we don't really need to kind of go over your basic work. And I will recommend anybody who's listening to this to maybe go back and listen to that podcast first. I think we can dig a little deeper. And I thought it'd be good to have you on after seeing you at the Strategic Management Society about a month ago and realizing that there's just a lot of stuff that we can talk about that I think would be interesting, not just to business practitioners, but also the academics who have been digging into this field for a while. Maybe we could start off with the problem that we were discussing at that conference, which is what is the role of academia in the business world? I mean, I think there's a view that people who are good business people somehow, I don't know, they either are born that way or they become that way through, their experience in the battlefield, right? And yet we have this entire industry, right? The MBA industry. And I think, a lot of academics look at the MBA education and they think of it as, something less than true academic education. It's kind of, used to be a bunch of war stories. I mean, it's become more academically sophisticated, but they still kind of look down on these MBAs. And then I think a lot of the MBAs, they often kind of look down on academia. They think, well, why do I need to learn theories and frameworks and practices? And so what exactly, how should we think about this intersection between academia and business practice?
Well, your discussion of the relationship between academics in the business school and, say, the rest of the university is actually well taken. There's actually two very important studies that were done in the late 1950s. I believe both 1959 for both of them. One was funded by the Ford Foundation and the other by the Carnegie Foundation. Up to that point, if you looked at sort of the unofficial status hierarchy of colleges in the university, business was the very lowest. So if you couldn't make it anywhere else, the students would then go get a degree in business. And it was kind of a sort of a chuckle, he's a business student. So it almost pejorative.
I like to joke with my students, my first major was astrophysics. And I say, I realized I wasn't smart enough for that. So I decided to go into business.
These two studies documented that the very low status of business education, business scholarship, and said, I think that one of the quotes that I like the most, something like, until business scholarship steps up and actually makes an academic contribution, the business schools will never rise in division status to make a difference to the university. And so beginning at Carnegie Mellon in the early 60s and then spreading pretty quickly throughout the rest of business schools in the United States and then even now in Europe and Asia, there was an attempt to double down on academic rigor. It probably started in either organizational behavior with his emphasis on being embedded in psychology, which has a long, academic tradition, or in finance, which is embedded more in economics. Some of the early finance stuff. I mean, so the finance used to be taught as a series of rules of thumb for how to raise capital. We kind of know this works. We kind of know this works.
Pecking order theory, right?
Yeah, for example. And And what came, the first theoretical contributions, Modigliani and Miller basically found, they made this efficient capital markets hypothesis that said that market structure, capital structure shouldn't matter in efficient markets. This was just radical. I mean, this is a radical observation. And it's one of those observations theoretically quite important. In practice, capital markets aren't perfectly efficient, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't matter. As a theoretical statement, was quite intriguing. And in a similar way, the Westinghouse studies in organizational behavior from decades ago would be, it turns out, for example, it's called something called the Hawthorne effect. If you have if you put someone in an experimental setting, they change their behavior. It doesn't really matter whether the thing you're telling them to do is good or bad. It changes the behavior. I mean, these were radical ideas that sort of were counterintuitive, deeply counterintuitive. And it became clear that, well, I mean, I'm the first to acknowledge that practice is very important. We have a lot to learn from practice. But practitioners aren't particularly good theorists. Why would they be? I mean, it's division of labor. Adam Smith is right. They're the academics who do the theory, and then there's the practitioners who practice. And so in studying in the 60s and then certainly through currently, the scholarship has really been enhanced dramatically. We have business school professors who win Nobel Prizes in economics who are making contributions to core economic theory rather than just sort of dabbling on the edges. And same with organizational behavior and psychology. I think there's been a lot of that. So that's the good news. The good news now is there is a much more rigorous scholarship underpinning a lot of what we teach in business schools. It's no longer people's, excuse me, getting over a cold, people's unique idiosyncratic experience, which may or may not generalize beyond their experience, to actually, having a rigorous analysis. That's the good news. The bad news is we now have a rigorous intellectual underpinning that disconnects us often from practice, to the point now that in my field, my primary field of work, strategic management, we're in a situation where it's almost as if we've become extremely good at rigorously and carefully answering questions no one really cares about. No one theoretically cares about, and no one in practice cares about. And so that disconnect between what the academics do and what happens in practice has really become an issue. And it's an unfortunate circumstance in my mind, because in fact, I don't pretend to be able to derive a general theory of practice from my research or from anyone else's research. There's always going to be the idiosyncratic, the unique, the situational, and that's very hard for general theory. But on the other hand, some of the stuff that gets put out there in the public press about how to manage organizations, or in my field, how to sustain competitive advantage, just doesn't make sense. I mean, it's just like doesn't stand up even to the most rudimentary analysis. I recently saw a headline advertising an article. I won't mention any details because it'll be embarrassing for everyone involved, but that basically said, here are the 6 or 7 things you have to do in your strategy to satisfy all of your stakeholders. Well, first of all, satisfying all of your stakeholders is only possible in the very rare event when all your stakeholders have the same interests in how they'd like to see your firm managed. And that almost never happens. So first of all, satisfying all your stakeholders is like a myth, okay? And then if I really had a list of 6 or 7 things that could generate that kind of sustained performance, then that would violate what's called the rules for riches paradox, which is if I have a set of rules that anyone can use to generate wealth, then they won't generate wealth, except for the person who's selling the rules. And so a little bit, I fully recognize the craziness of that we have now of being so focused on answering in great rigor, detailed questions no one's interested in. But on the other hand, a little bit of academic rigor can be actually pretty helpful and sort of help sift through the insanity. So that is the challenge we have now, is that I by that I mean pretty much of the business school, not everyone obviously, but much of the research that's done in the business school is by academics for academics with limited implications for practice. But that does not mean we should give up the effort to try to bring these two together. Certainly, my book on culture change was an explicit attempt to do that. I have in working with real companies on strategy and strategy implementation, it always became very, very clear that I usually say at this point, if you quote me, I'll deny it, but I'm now going on record, that the strategy formulation question that we spend all our time on is usually not a very hard question. Okay, it's about 15 minutes of discussion, and you can figure out what the right thing to do is. Everything else is about implementation. And so a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of it has to do with the kind of organizational culture you have. So I knew that. I've known that from the very beginning as I try to implement some strategy and then just run right in head first into this cultural brick wall. And the question of how to change an organizational culture, well, that's actually a hard question, it turns out. And so that book and that research is really an explicit attempt to try to address that intellectual problem, but also do so in a way that's available and accessible to managers and practitioners more generally. I don't know how this will evolve because among many senior scholars, both in finance and accounting and marketing and strategy and organizational behavior, I think there's widespread understanding that we have an obligation to practice. Certainly in my field, strategy, there's always been this sense of an obligation to practice. But there are so many incentives for junior people to ask very narrow questions very precisely, ask and answer very narrow questions very precisely, that whether we can strike the right balance or not is still a very open question in my mind.
Well, I even would question the notion that the people selling those rules can make money, right? Because you can only sell it once, and then you Xerox it and
you need to have a subscription. You need to have a subscription model. My favorite example is this guy on the web. I'm not sure he's still on, but I saw him a few years ago on the web, and he's a Hong Kong Chinese, and he would say, "Yeah, I started my life desperately poor. I had no money. I was, and I worked very, very hard. And I discovered a very simple way that you can become wealthy just like me. And all you have to do is follow and implement these three simple words. If you learn these three simple words and apply them, then you too can become wealthy as me." So at that point, I stopped the video and asked my students, well, what might those three words be? Okay. And it turns out that the students usually come up with marry rich spouse. This is true. Or divorce rich spouse. This is also true. And so we have fun with that. And it turns out, after all is said and done, the three words are never give up, which, sometimes exactly the right thing to do is to give up. I mean,
there's some survivorship bias, I think, in the in that rule, right? Yeah.
So clearly that's a rules for riches that was not going to make anyone. But he says, I will teach you how to apply these three words in my workshop, and all I have to do is pay for the tuition. And so he's trying to make money that way. I'm not sure he ever did, but.
Well, I also want to push back on this strategy formulation exercise that you just mentioned. It's easy for you, and I think it's also easy for me, because we have a lot of experience with this, and oftentimes, and I think you probably do this. I certainly do this. I just did this a couple times this last week. You'll meet with some corporate executives, and you might start off knowing very little about their business. And by the end of a couple hours, you've learned enough to actually offer some pretty good advice, which they may not have seen simply because they were too deep into the trenches. And, this is particularly for startups, right? I mean, a VC can come in and with 3 sentences completely alter the course of that startup. And that skill, I mean, that seems to be a skill it's a real skill, but it requires an enormous amount of training and thought. And it seems to be the kind of skill that oftentimes disappears like the longer you are enmeshed in a particular situation. And so how is that skill? And I remember when when I first started teaching strategy, we were mostly trying to train people for consulting jobs, right? At, BCG and Bain and so forth. And that's what they considered their role to be, right? Being able to size up a situation very quickly, maybe outside of any particular industry, and, get a handle on what strategy needs to be. Why is that so hard? I mean, why does it take so much training, and why isn't that a sort of skill that is widely diffused?
Well, there's two ways to develop that skill. And you described both of them. One of them is you can be a very seasoned VC. That has just a lot of experience, and this accumulative wisdom allows you to sort of see through the silliness and get focused on what really matters. I don't have that luxury, so I have to. So I use theory. So when I come to a client, I bring with me this tool basket of about 9 or 10 theories, depending on your perspective, and I listen for a while, and I say, "Oh, well, there's a problem. I know that's a transaction cost problem." Boom! I have this whole set of routines and ideas and questions I can ask. Um, I have enough flexibility in my theoretical toolkit that I'm pretty confident to be able to identify what the issues are very, very quickly. I think developing those skills is different than asking why is it that senior managers sometimes don't have those skills. And part of it is a simple division of labor. Senior managers, the ones I know, are responsible. I'm not a big agency 30 guy. I think these people are working really hard. They're trying to do the best they can, most of the time trying to address the needs of their shareholders and whatever stakeholders are important to them. I actually think data supports that observation. But they are so dang busy running the day-to-day. And the day-to-day is just a bunch of crap. You know that, I know that, they know that. Okay, it's like personnel problems, and so-and-so is fighting so-and-so, and we can't get the supplier to show up on time. All that
all
crap.
hands.
It's just exactly, constant.
Firefighting.
And the luxury to sit back and sort of say, okay, let me think deeply about the future of my company and how we need to get our culture and strategy in line. That just doesn't happen that often. And so there is a role for outsiders to be able to basically have the time and also have the expertise to be able to come in and do these things. So I think the best managers I know are able to take the time. In fact, one of the things I counsel them is that you're too busy. You've made yourself too busy. It's like you're afraid to not have free time to think. And in so doing, you are doing a disservice to the organization. So, just chill a little bit, take a little bit more time for yourself and go off, turn off your phone. And if you need to, take some people with you and really think in a pretty unstructured way about your future and your company. It is. That used to happen more than it does now. I think we are now inundated with everything in our face all the time that all of us, including me, I mean, I don't have options. I have faculty meetings, classes, all this stuff, grading papers, all the insanity of being a professor is all there too. And I just have to say, okay, I'm going to give you an example of this. I had a young colleague, smart guy, and he's been very successful. But he was very young at the time. And he came to my office and said, I'm just not being as productive as I thought I was going to be as a professor. I said, well, that can happen. I said, well, tell me about a typical day. He says, well, I come in early. I exercise. I come in really early, like 6 o'clock. And the first thing I do is I answer all my emails. And I said, oh, stop there. You can answer
Right.
all your emails? And he says, yeah, my goal is to have a 0 email inbox at the end of each day. And I say, I got that if you're a middle manager, I got that. But that's not your job. Your job is not to answer all your emails. Your job is to think creatively about questions that are bigger than that, and in focusing on the minutia of the job, you can lose the purpose of the job, and so I try to have the optimally full email box with lots of unanswered emails because most of them aren't important, and if they're really important, they usually get back to me. That's good enough, okay? So, I know CEOs can have that to death. They have their one meeting after another, and and I recommend backing off. So part of it's just division of labor, part of it's just the reality of the job. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think you co-authored an article on kind of theoretical discovery and how it happens, and new theory formulation, and I think for a lot of academics, I mean, there was a time in their career when they were just experiencing these fresh discoveries almost continuously. I mean, I remember, when I was in grad school, it's like, oh, wow, like, Jensen and Meckling, oh, this is amazing. And then Alkian and Demsis, like, oh, this is amazing. And then, and Coase, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And Modigliani Miller, oh my gosh. And so you're just experiencing all these wows, and then you start to come up with ideas. And then at some point, right, during your academic career, you just get so consumed with some incremental publication that it kind of fizzles.
Publishing the next paper problem, yes.
Yeah. So how do academics kind of avoid that?
Yeah, that's a really hard problem. And again, most of these all hard problems are hard because they don't have easy solutions. But first of all, let me remind. I also had that same experience. When I was a brand new assistant professor, my first job was at UCLA, and my mentor and good friend, Bill Ochi, had just organized a conference on sort of the practical implications and theoretical implications of the new institutional economics. And those people, Williamson, Alchin, Demsetz, David Teese, they were all there. And I knew nothing about what they were doing. And so I was in the audience going, wow, what? It's like some sort of a revelatory experience. It was a remarkable thing. And I went back to my PhD program and told my professor about this, and he said, no, that organizational economics stuff has no future in the study of management. Well, it turned out he was wrong. In any case, so that was great. And what drives most of us is this interest in the theory and a set of ideas. But in the midst of that, we get caught up in what do we have to do to publish the next paper? Because if you don't have 6 published papers, you're not going to have a job. I get that. I understand the incentive structure, okay? I'm not calling anyone out saying shame on you for wanting to keep a job. That just makes a lot of sense. But for those who don't know, we live in an up or out system. So if you don't get these 6 or so papers published in top journals in the first 5 or 6 years of your career, you're gone. You have to get a job someplace else. And it's very hard to go up in that. You almost always go down in the status hierarchy, and so it's a real challenge. And so what can happen is we can become so focused on getting that next paper published. Now the dream is, I'm going to focus on marginal contributions that are done carefully and rigorously to get those first 6 papers published. But then I'm going to get tenure, and then I'm going to change. And then I'm going to start asking bigger questions. That happens sometimes, but very rarely. Basically, we're kind of like rats. We get rewarded for publishing marginal work. We just keep publishing marginal work, or we stop altogether. By the way,
so there's a treatment element, not just a selection element in terms of.
Oh, I think there's a treatment effect. Absolutely. You learn it. There probably is a selection effect as well. We probably recruit PhD students who are particularly skilled in doing incremental work, sometimes because that helps associate professors do their incremental work. I mean, I think there could be a selection effect as well as a treatment effect. But at some point, you have to decide what it is you want to be when you grow up. What do you want to do? I am not a goal-oriented person. I don't set explicit goals because it seems to me that the way the world works, setting explicit goals for one's career could limit things as much as it could enhance things, right? Because I could never have imagined the career that I have. So if I set a goal that I could have imagined when I was assistant professor, I would have not been able to have the career that I actually ended up having. So while I'm not goal oriented in that sense, I always did have a kind of ambition, which was that that I would do the kind of work so that someday, if one of my children decided to get an MBA, they would study my work in their MBA program. And that would be great from my point of view, because that would mean some things. It would mean, first of all, that whatever work I did was so widely accepted as to be almost taken for granted in the field. And that the only way you get the MBA curriculum is it's got to be like really well accepted. Okay, well, and the second of all, it would have some practical implications because the MBA still it's a practice degree.
And it has to be summarizable in a format that your grandma can understand.
That's right. And by the way, I used to say that was an embarrassment that people could understand. My grandma could understand my work. I actually would see that as a compliment. If I can take really complex ideas and simplify them so much so that a reasonably intelligent grandma would be able to understand it, that would be awesome. And the thing that's fun is that actually happened to me. So my son got his MBA at Oxford Said and business school. And when he took the strategy class, they studied my stuff, and the professor said, and we have the son of the guy who wrote most of the stuff here in class. I don't think he's ever forgiven me for that. But that makes it very, very rewarding. I don't think, I could be wrong, but I don't think that the people who are taking thin slices of questions and answering them in a very rigorous way will ever enjoy that experience. Maybe that's unrealistic to expect that many people can have that experience, but certainly if you don't do work that could have that implications, you're not going to have that kind of impact going forward.
Well, I want to talk a bit about the place of strategy in the field of economics, right? Of course, John Roberts and others won the Nobel Prize, but it's hard to imagine whether Michael Porter, Jay Barney, David Teese, right, winning the Nobel Prize, because strategy, even though it's rooted in economics, it's kind of like a stepchild, right? I mean, economists kind of look over there and say, those people, they're not kind of like us. And to the extent that strategy has economics envy, the way economics has physics envy, if it indulges that, it sort of stops becoming useful to some degree, right?
I agree. I think it's unlikely. You're right for all the reasons. I think there are some people who do the winner of the Nobel Prize here recently studied creative destruction. Well, that's an idea that was Schumpeter's original idea. They developed a model for it, and then that's something we use a lot in strategy, innovation research particularly. So there are, and then Kahneman and Tversky did with their cognitive psychology stuff. Spence with Marcus Aurelius. I mean, we can have examples of stuff that's closer to strategy rather than further away from strategy. But we're generally not economic enough to be considered in that sense. But I actually have come to conclude that that's a deep compliment, in the sense that I was talking about the limitations of strategy work being focusing on answering very narrow questions very, very rigorously. Um, uh, Economics as a field is much worse than us. I mean, it's essentially so often, there are, of course, exceptions, and there's always good work done out there. And I like behavioral economists are doing some interesting things and on and on. But much of the work that's published in the top journals is an exercise in um, technical flash, mathematical sophistication, rather than really addressing interesting questions in interesting ways. So, but it is the case that some of what we do in strategy, of this new version of strategy I'm talking about, with this focus on causal identification, et cetera, is economics envy. But I'm a strategy guy, so if I'm thinking about strategy, if strategy as a field wants to be um, generate superior performance, whatever that means, it wants to be recognized for status. It seems to me the thing to do is to be excellent at who we are rather than mediocre at someone else. So it's better to be an excellent strategy person than a mediocre economist. So while I use economic theory a lot, I'm not ashamed to say that. Um, I think that we ask the different questions that are asked by economists, and our questions ultimately have important policy and other implications as well. So, yeah, I think that's okay.
What are those key differences? I mean, because when you talk about how you got into the field, there was the whole structure, conduct, performance stuff,
Sure,
right?
sure,
There was
sure,
transaction cost economics and agency.
sure.
Those are economic domains.
Sure,
At
sure.
what point does it stop being economics and start becoming strategy?
It probably, there's not a bright line. Um, but let me now I'll tell you the story of sort of how I wrote this paper. And David Teese plays a role in this, interestingly enough. So um, I started in agency theory. Actually, I went to a finance colleague of mine named Tom Copeland, and said, "I'm a new assistant professor. I don't know what I'm doing here. Is there anything in finance I should read?" As a sort of organizations guy, he said, "You need to read Jensen and Meckling." So I went to the library. Library, that's the place where they used to store books. I went to the
Oh yeah.
library and got a journal and read this article. And I read it quickly because I had read most of my organization theory stuff in my doc PhD program.
Was that Journal of
And
Financial Economics? Was it? I can't remember what.
JFE, yeah, JFE. I think
Yeah.
maybe one of the first issues of JFE, yeah, in '76, I think. In any case, and I went back to Tom and I said, here's what I understand. And he said, "No, you got it wrong." So I figured I didn't have a second chance. So I went back and I actually spent 6 weeks reading that article. And the reason it took 6 weeks is that each sentence, especially in the first third of the paper, it's a very long paper, but in the first third of the paper, every sentence implied a literature I didn't know anything about. So I would read a sentence, then I would go read that literature. Then I read the next
Find the
sentence,
footnotes. Go find the footnotes. Right? Yeah.
exactly, on and on and on. And it took 6 weeks, but afterwards I was able to explain Jensen Meckling, I think, better than Jensen and Meckling. And so I came back to Tom Copeland, like explained it. He said, "Yeah, you understand it now." And what was really interesting to me was not so much agency theory, although that's a useful theory and I use it sometimes. It was efficient capital market theory. That's what really,
Yeah.
that was, you talked about that. Wow, what an idea moment. And that Modigliani Miller, that goes back a long ways, but I didn't know anything about it. And in the process, I essentially trained myself to become a Chicago school economist and the efficient capital markets guy. And then I read Mike Porter's book. I was asked to teach a strategy class, so I thought, well, I better read some strategy before I teach this class. Right. And I read Mike Porter's book, and I just did not like it at all. I still have the book in my office at home. It's got really nasty comments on the side, on the margins, like, this makes no sense. And I didn't understand my virulent reaction to Porter's work. and so I actually wrote 2 papers. So this is what professors do. We write papers to understand our emotions. Okay. So why am I so angry? So I wrote these 2 papers. And the first one was originally titled Why Michael Porter is Wrong, which is, arrogance beyond imagining for an assistant professor. Um, but then what happened was ultimately it became this paper on strategic factor markets. It was published ultimately in Management Science in 1986. I wrote it in 84 when I was 30 years old, and I published it in 86 in Management Science. And the simple argument there is, and it's not said this way, but sort of you can get it from the article. Porter says, if you create imperfectly competitive product markets, you can earn economic profits. And my analysis said, well, in order to create those imperfectly competitive product markets, you have to get access to resources that enable you to implement strategies to do that. Those resources are acquired, access to those resources is acquired through factor markets, strategic factor markets. And when strategic factor markets are efficient, in the sense that they anticipate the value they're going to create in product markets, you can create a non-competitive product market, but you won't make a profit because it will all be gobbled up in the factor market. So most of the paper is about, well, when will factor markets not be efficient? And it turns out the answer is there's just 2. You can be lucky in the sense that no one knew what the value of the factor was actually going to be, the factor of production is actually going to be. That's just called luck. Or you can have better expectations about the future value than anyone else. And why could you do that? Because you leverage unique resources and capabilities that no one else has. That's called resource-based theory. Okay, so that paper was submitted to Management Science. I got 3 reviews. I actually know 2 of the 3 reviewers. They told me. I didn't do this. They told me. One I don't know. And that reviewer's comment was, this paper is way too theoretical and strategy doesn't do theory work this way. And so I just ignored that one, and so did the editor. And so the second review was by David Teese, he told me. And he basically said, there's nothing new here. And he's right with regard to the factor market story. He's not right with regard to its implications for strategy. And he wasn't a strategy guy, and he has since recognized that. And so he recommended rejection. And then the third reviewer, who was a guy named Peter Larange, who's what the time very well known. He's retired since, but very well known strategy guy at Wharton, went on to do some really interesting things. He wrote, "This is the most interesting strategy paper I've ever read." Okay, so all right. So I go through 5 rounds of revision, and no one changes their mind, and the paper finally gets published. But the only reason I get to go to tell that story is that it tells you the difference between strategy and economics. So the economics people are interested in equilibria, and the underlying assumption is that in most equilibrium situations, economic profits will be driven away. And the only exceptions to that are sort of monopoly rents or those kinds of bad for society things. And this argument says, yeah, no. Sometimes factor markets can be inefficient, not because people are colluding or engaging in monopolistic behavior, but because they simply know things and understand things that are not widely known and understood. Harold Denseth wrote this argument in a very abbreviated form previously to me, and I cited that paper, obviously, but this I made for strategy people. And so by the way, that kind of specialized understanding that allows you to get access to resources and capabilities before others it turns out to be consistent with social welfare. It's not bad. It's good for society. Right. It's good if I know how to meet customer needs better than someone else, and so I do that. That's customers like that. They're willing to pay more for it because I have something that they can't get from anyone else, and it's a good thing. So that's a really big difference between the 2 fields. Now, over the years, some economists have begun to say, maybe there are some important differences across firms. There's a guy named Bloom, whom I'm sure you know, who has studied firms and discovered, I'm glad you're sitting now because this will shock you, and discovered that firms vary in their management capability. I mean, it's just
No.
like unbelievable. No, seriously, this is true, and it's now
Right.
documented by him, and he's done a great job. But this is not something we discovered in strategy. This is something we started with in strategy, and then
Yeah.
and trying to understand the implications of that going forward. So I think there are differences. Some of them are masked by the math, and there are some math modelers. I use math models when it's the right way to do it, to engage in conversation. But there's some people who are in strategy who do that as well, which is fine. But that debating about whether it should be math or not is like debating should it be French or German. It's just two different languages. They're just accomplishing the same thing. Um, and have strengths and weaknesses, just like different languages have strengths and weaknesses. But that's not, to me, that's not what separates the two fields. It really is. We're interested in sustaining superior performance and trying to understand why that's possible, where most economists are not. There are always exceptions to that rule, but most are not.
Yeah, I mean, I remember early in my career, I was teaching corporate finance, right? And in corporate finance, it's perfectly acceptable to assume that financial markets are perfectly efficient, which means there's no such thing as, a positive NPV investment in the financial markets.
Right.
But then we flip it around and we say, but of course, you're out there continuously, investing in positive NPV projects. And it's like, well, wait a second. If markets are so efficient, how is there a positive NPV project anywhere? It doesn't make any sense, right?
Yeah, I always like that. I mean, I love finance. I use it a lot. And efficient capital markets is something I love as a theory, because it's a foil against which I can then, argue. Because you're exactly right. I love it. Really Myers, in the early first or second edition of their textbook, which I have in my office at home, it's 600 pages long. It's really dense, and then they have one chapter titled "Where Do Net Present Value Projects Come From?" and it's about 6 pages long. And the answer is basically, we don't know. But the good news is later on, they edited the book, and then now there's 3 chapters in the book, middle of the book, titled "Where Do Net Present Value Projects Come From?" And they do a really good job of saying more precisely, we don't know. You can't in finance, if capital markets are efficient, then you shouldn't have net present value, positive net present value. And so that underlying contradiction is interesting, which is why behavioral finance is interesting, which is why a lot of good things are happening in the finance around those issues. But the finance that is taught to sort of baby finance that taught to MBA students doesn't cut it that way. But we're interested in where do positive net present value projects come from, and that's actually a really hard question to answer. Good thing, because that's my career.
I mean, well, it also is why you are a professor of entrepreneurship as well. And it seems like entrepreneurship at one point was sort of considered distinct from strategy, right? It wasn't, strategy was for established companies, who are Coca-Cola and, IBM and these guys. And innovation was sort of tangential, and certainly entrepreneurship was tangential. And I think even to this day, entrepreneurship is somewhat under theorized, right? We don't really have as much.
I think you're being a little generous.
I mean, we've got real options theory, right? I mean, real options theory
but the real options wouldn't be considered an entrepreneurial theory by most entrepreneurship scholars. You can only value real options under condition of risk, and the general story is that entrepreneurs operate under conditions of 19 uncertainty. So you can't value real options. You can talk about flexibility as a concept, but real options theory with its application of Black-Scholes kind of logic sort of breaks down under 19 uncertainty. I'm saying stuff that not all entrepreneurship people even agree with. So I think that I think entrepreneurship is so. There are a lot of strategy people, including some of my colleagues at the University of Utah, who have argued in print that entrepreneurship is a special case of strategy. I actually don't think that's the case. And I think that's because entrepreneurship doesn't just talk about innovation, which can be analyzed in real options terms and some other things. It talks about the creation of new products or services that did not exist previously. So, to say it in a way that economists might fully appreciate, um, while Bayesian decision making is a very rational approach to making decisions, in an entrepreneurial world, you don't have access to rational priors that you can update. And so any sort of theoretical or empirical model that sort of assumes risk or Bayesian updating or any of those kinds of things, I think is distinct from entrepreneurship. Now, that's the good news, bad news, right? Because the good news is that creates a clear domain for the field of entrepreneurship, which is the study of decision-making under 19 uncertainty, or the decision-making when Bayesian updating doesn't apply. There's lots of ways of saying it. The bad news is that turns out to be a damn hard problem, okay? There's a reason why economists have gone in another direction, because going into 19 uncertainty where, you can be lucky, you can guess and get lucky, but that's hardly constitutes a very rigorous theory. So yeah, and in entrepreneurship, one reason that it's under theorized as a field is because the theory is really hard, because many of the assumptions and attributes that makes it possible to theorize in non-entrepreneurial settings don't apply in entrepreneurial settings. And so then we're stuck with this 19 uncertainty and the difficulties associated with that. Now, I have some papers written on that to talk about how entrepreneurial opportunities, for example, this is with my colleague Sharon Alvarez, opportunities in entrepreneurial settings under 19 uncertainty are not discovered. They're endogenous to entrepreneurial action. So entrepreneurs act and then they learn quickly. So in an evolutionary way, they end up creating their own, the opportunities they end up exploiting. This is a way of sort of getting to that pre-Bayesian uncertainty world into a world where we can actually start talking about strategies. But it's that particular model is evolutionary in character, and that has strengths and limitations. It's descriptively interesting, predictively not terribly relevant. So I still can't tell an entrepreneur this will make you money. Of course, that would violate the rules for riches anyway. But nevertheless, it's a hard problem theoretically, and I think there's reason for it. It is the case that the most popular theories, either in practice like lean startup or in research like entrepreneurial orientation, are in an ironic kind of way at their core not terribly entrepreneurial in nature. I'm not saying it's bad work. I think it's really good work, but the question of where does that initial insight come from, and how does that evolve into something that we could call an opportunity ex post? How does that happen? I don't think actually lean starts with an idea, and then you figure out, test it quickly, let it fail. But it sort of assumes away the question, where does the idea come from in the first place? Where's that initial spark come from?
Yeah, I mean, how do you get around the tautology problem, right? So it seems like some people might look at a lot of this work and say, yeah, this is tautological. Like, you're successful because you have, resources and capabilities that make you successful, right? And then you say, well, okay, well, how do we know that they're the right ones? Well, they make you successable. So there we go, right? And, same thing with dynamic capabilities, right? What are they? They're the ones. So how do you get around that? I mean, should we view these in the same way as we view, falsifiable hypotheses and so forth?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. So first of all, almost all theories in social theory, certainly economics, start with some good solid tautologies. So and we should not be afraid that we use tautologies in some of our assumptions based. The classic tautology in economics is that all behavior is self-interested. Well, what about the person who sacrifices themselves? Well, then we
must have really liked it.
Must really like this, right? It's all they are masochists. That's always in self-interest. So that's tautology as well. So the thing is, some tautologies are useful and others are not, and they're useful when they're put in a context that allows us to give some empirical or theoretical constraints on when a tautology applies or not. So just saying everyone is self-interested is not useful. But if we can then say, and here's a utility function that has some attributes, and then we can derive theory from that, and then we can test whether those implications are right. Now that also becomes useful. And I think it's the same way in strategy. So for example, in my own work, I make it very clear in my MBA classes. In fact, I say it in a joking way, only half seriously, maybe a third seriously. It says, I may not always be right, but I'm never wrong. And what I mean by that is, I can't tell you what strategy will make you money. Because if I could, that would be a rules for riches and there'd be a tautology in there someplace, right? But I can tell you what's not going to work. Okay, what's not going to be a source of sustained competitive advantage. So like AI is an example. I mean, people are all wild about AI and it's changing the world and all that's true. And yet,
I've got ChatGPT.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, but unless there are some government enforced impediments to using AI or whatever, I mean, everyone's going to use AI because it does change the world. And so AI by itself is not a source of competitive advantage. So you come to me as an AI. I mean, I have these conversations with tech companies because they seem to be investing in AI. That seems to be settling down now. But for the last few years, they've been investing in AI under the assumption that there's some giant positive cash flows can be generated by that going forward. In 5 years, everyone will be using AI in the same ways. I'm sorry, it's going to be competitive parity. It's like personal computers. I remember when they were first introduced, and the first companies that used them effectively got some temporary advantages. But I did this consulting project with a rural entrepreneur, a Ghanaian entrepreneur in rural Ghana. And he had a PC. I mean, come and give me a break. Everyone has a PC. That's a source of competitive parity. So I think what we can say, I can't tell you, here are a list of 10 things you need to do. This is why I said earlier, this list of 6 things that every strategy has to have. It's just absurd. But I can tell you, if you're going to have a strategy that's likely to be a source of sustained competitive advantage, you have to figure out how that leverages resources or capabilities that are socially complex. Why? Because that's harder to imitate. Stuff that's developed over long periods of time that's path dependent. Why? Because that's hard to imitate. Or stuff that's causally ambiguous, where you don't know how to develop those capabilities because that makes it hard to imitate. And so I can make some empirical predictions that socially complex resources and capabilities should last longer. As long as their value is retained, they should last longer than non-socially complex. And then I take that criteria and I apply it to AI, and I say, this AI as a technology a source of sustained competitive advantage? The answer is clearly not. Clearly not. It's going to be diffused very rapidly. In fact, it's probably diffused the most rapidly of any technology in my lifetime. I was at a conference, that SMS conference. I don't know if you were at that session, where the speaker said, how many of you used AI in your work 5 years ago? And no hands went up.
Right.
How many of you use AI now in your work? And all hands went up. I mean, so basically it's diffused 100%. So now, some people will be more skilled at using AI than others, but that's not AI. That's skills they're using. That's flexibility. That's creativity. That's innovativeness. That's all outside AI, but technology is constant. So I think that we can avoid the tautology problem by addressing, identifying the characteristics that resources and capabilities need to have in order to be sources of sustained advantage. And then empirical predictions come out of that, but they don't come out of a tautology by definition.
Well, I think you and I were both at an event sponsored by BCG and our friend Martin Reeves. Yeah. And it was all about the disconnect between strategists in the field and strategists in academia. And I'm wondering, to what extent was this just sort of a, I don't know, just confusion over relevant language? When you ask doctors what they're interested in, you ask patients what they're interested in, they're going to say different things. Like patients can say, I'm interested in inflammation, and the doctor's going to say, I'm interested in cytokines, but it's like the same thing. I mean, and so when they survey business people, they're like, we're interested in AI, and strategy professors aren't writing about AI. And it's like, well, hold on a second. Like, what you're really interested in are resource and capabilities, right? So, so whenever somebody asks me about AI, I mean, I wind up talking about, all of some of these things are timeless, and they just need to be translated into the specifics of the situation. So, I mean,
we generate general theory. We don't generate specific theory. We should be generating general theory. By the way, it's interesting because I had a similar experience. I was at an academic meeting someplace, and someone said, I don't see anyone really testing resource-based theory. And I said, well, that's possible. So tell me, what's your dissertation on? And they described their dissertation. I said, so in what way is that not a resource-based story? I don't understand. Because they think testing resource-based theory means measuring value, immutability, and rarity. No, that's an organizing framework. The empirical implications are about social complexity and those other things. So a lot of confusion. Some of it's vocabulary, some of it's language, but we have to accept responsibility as scholars to find ways periodically to take our general theory and apply them in a very specific case. So AI turns out to be, for me, a great place to do that. And I can barely use the computer, but I've written 2 papers on artificial intelligence and sustained competitive advantage, one with Martin Rees, and the other was a computer scientist that was in MIT Sloan, so HBR and MIT Sloan. But it turns out I think we have lots of examples where we can do this. It goes back to my earlier statement about not always being right, but never being wrong. I usually can tell pretty quickly whether a firm's strategy meets the criteria that, have been established in the theory about social complexity, path dependence, and causal ambiguity. And if it doesn't, I can't tell them what to do, but I can tell them that's not going to work for sustained competitive advantage. But we need to do that more consistently as a field. There's no doubt about that.
Well, I mean, when it comes to... Good.
I was going to say, I will say that with regard to the marginal contributions addressed in very rigorous kinds of way, I said earlier, that's research that answering in a very precise way questions no one's interested in. I mean, no one is interested in them. I'm not interested in them as a scholar, and I don't think practitioners are interested in, unless you, by accident, happen to choose an empirical setting that is directly relevant to a particular firm, then that's fine. But rarely, I mean, I have not found that work useful when I go into companies, because it's so, to be able to do the identification things that are required usually requires such strong assumptions about your database and your measures that even to do it well, it can't be generalized. It was highly specialized. And so, yeah, I think that in that case, that's not just vocabulary. That really is that we are missing each other in some fundamental ways. But a lot of some more traditional work, well, I have a theory toolbox. It's a very useful toolbox, and what I can do is I can translate those theories into your setting fairly quickly, and then ask you a bunch of questions, and the result of that is we'll know whether this is a source of advantage or not.
Well, I'm wondering how you explain to your MBA students the relevance of theory, because I feel like every semester I have to kind of provide a mini lecture on why they need to learn theory. Because when I do case studies and I ask people questions, they just sort of blather on and just grab random facts and throw them at the wall to try to see what sticks. And I have to explain to them that with the fire hose of data that they're getting, and particularly in a world of
more important, not less important.
It's more important that they have some way of organizing and knowing what questions to ask rather than just hoping that staring at all this information, it's just going to just pop out. I mean, how do you explain? I mean, do you ever get questions about like, why are we learning all this theory and stuff?
Actually, I don't. And then in the following sense, I'd love to hear what you say, because I don't try to explain why we use theory. I don't. I just, what I try to do is demonstrate that it makes a difference. I have this, so the way I teach resource-based theory, for example, is I don't give a lecture on it. I say, the specific thing I do is I have created a fake business that I own and operate. It's called Barney's Hot Dog Stand. I have a website in case you're interested. It's called Barney's Hot Dogs. And the story I tell. And
do you have swag? Can we get T-shirts or anything?
In principle, you can. I actually have.
Okay.
The students have made me some swag over the years, right? And the story I tell is that it's very successful. And then I pick a number. It's generating $50,000 a month in net income or something. It's very successful. And my wife and I wanted to figure out how we could expand it, but we're so busy running the restaurant that we don't have time to sort of sit back. So to think about that big question. So I want to use this opportunity to get your ideas. And so what makes a hot dog stand successful? And I just open it up, and then we generate this long list of things, and it's fun. Trying to make it a lot of fun, Some will say, well, it's your marketing skills, and I'll, you've heard our jingle, and then I'll have them sing the jingle, Barney's hot dogs can't know about they're hot, and it's great fun. But in this process of generating this list, there's one answer that always comes up, which is, it's you have sauces and condiments, and I said, yeah, we have our standard condiments. Here they are, onions and mustard and ketchup. And we also have 3 special sauces, the red sauce, the green sauce, and the yellow sauce. And they're based on secret recipes that come from my wife's great-great-grandmother, and those kinds of things. And so that always comes up. So we go this whole list, and then we say, okay, which of these attributes of our hot dog stand explain its success in the long run, our long-run success? And you go through all of them, and, for example, high-quality hot dogs. You got to have high-quality hot dogs. Got it. We get ours from Oscar Mayer, just like everyone else. Okay, competitive pair. Got to have good buns. Absolutely. We get ours from a local baker, just like everyone else. And you go through this long list, and you see that everything on the list that they think is important for generating sustained competitive advantage is actually a source of competitive parity. That's theory, okay? That's what the theory says. It's just because it's not socially complex, it's not path dependent, it's not causally ambiguous, and none of those things are, except for 2 things. One of them is the sauce, okay? And it actually is a secret sauce, okay? Now, that's kind of a pun. What's your secret sauce? And there really is a secret sauce here. And the other one is causal ambiguity. It's not that we do any one of these things well. We do all 25 well. That's what makes us special, is this complexity of execution is causally ambiguous. And that's what the theory says, okay? Then I say, okay, what's our strategy? What should our strategy be if it's the sauce? And the answer is sell the sauce, okay? So What we should be doing is bottling sauce and doing those things and all that stuff. And so what if it's the complexity of execution, all the things we're doing? How should we grow the business? And the answer is we got to open up more stores. And the way you do that, of course, is through franchising. But to do franchising, you have to demonstrate that you have a system in place. And so you have to open a couple of different stores. And I said, I don't know. I can't tell you for sure which of those 2 strategies is the right way of growing our hot dog business. Is it sell the sauce, or open franchises, or maybe both? I don't know. But I can tell you, until you know what your source of sustained competitive advantage is, you can't develop a rational growth strategy. Boom, drop the mic, leave, okay? They haven't read the book perhaps, but don't know anything about the theory. but they've applied the theory. I've gotten them to apply the theory in a way. It's very straightforward. And the result of it is, until you know what your strategy, until you know what your source of sustained competitive advantage is, you can't do a growth strategy, which is a very general point that many firms forget because they think what they need to do is take last year's stuff and increase it by 5%. I don't preach theory at all. I just do theory.
Well, you do in the sense that, okay, after this exercise, now they've spent a lot of time and they've come to a realization that it's the secret sauce, let's say. And then you say, okay, now I've got a new company, right? And this company is in the automotive business. And then they say, oh, well, it must be because of the brakes. And you're like, no, like, what did you learn from the last? So the theory to me is how you take some learning and make it portable, right? Like in
fact, that's exactly what we do. After I go through the exercise, that's all the preliminaries. It's about 40-minute preliminary before we actually talk about a case. And the case we talk about, and this is an old case, I'm almost embarrassed how old it is crown, cork, and seal. And then
that is old.
I mean, that's been around for like 7,000 years.
Yeah.
And the reason I do crown, cork, and seal is because the way the case is written, many students will conclude that the source of their sustained competitive advantage is the leader. So they're going to generate the list, right?
Yeah.
And it turns out it's not true. That one doesn't work, okay? And then another one is there's international operations. That's true for a while, but that's not going to last very long.
Right.
And then there's this last thing they do, which is emergency inventory, which almost never ever gets. It's in the case. I'm not making any of this stuff up. And okay, let's talk about emergency inventory. How does that add value? Why has that lasted as long as it has? And is it going to last going forward? And the answer to that last question is no, it's not. You have to have a new theory of sustained advantage. What might that be? And so the entire case is just Barney's hot dogs applied to can manufacturing.
Yeah.
But anyway, I don't actually, in MBA class, I don't talk about theory. I just use it. And I'll do that for agency problems. When we do corporate strategy, it'll be agency, but I'll set the scenario where, why would these people engage in these behaviors versus these behaviors? And so I think actually it's not my quote, but it's there's nothing quite as useful as a good theory, and so I just try to demonstrate that time and time again.
Yeah, and so I mean, I think your goal, like mine, I think, is to give them this toolbox, right? So they have a collection of frameworks and theories, and then hopefully they have the capacity to reach in and grab the right one in the right circumstance. And I got a question from a student just the other day, and he said, well, how do you know, when and where to use which theories? And what he was looking for was sort of a checklist or he wanted just like a decision tree. Like, okay, let's see if 5 forces yields me anything. And if the answer is no, then I'm going to move down to resources. And if that doesn't do anything, then I'm going to move down, so he wanted this to be like a systematic thing that he could regularize. And unfortunately it's not quite like that.
Well, it's not a decision tree, but it is the case that the theories apply in different settings. I'll give you another example. Yeah. I was hired by a company years ago now to give a speech at one of their company meetings, And I'm normally hired to do resource-based stuff, idiosyncratic firms and all this capability. But I had lunch with these guys and before my presentation, and it was clear that was not the game they were playing. They were playing Michael Porter's game, okay, in the following sense. There were 2 firms in North America that together had 95% market share. One was more prominent in the eastern part of the United States, one more prominent in the western part of the United States. And this is a product I actually own. And I bought this product, and I thought, this thing is really expensive because it's essentially bent metal. And that's all, just bent metal. And I said, why are you charging $600 for bent metal? I don't get it. Well, I get it now because you basically got an oligopoly, okay, with high barriers to entry. And so I said, okay, this is the world they're living in. Now, I'm not going to go into the social welfare implications of this. Got that? But it seems to me You need to do the following. Engage in R&D, but go slow and announce it well in advance. Don't surprise your competitor. All this stuff that Porter would talk about to maintain inclusive relationships. So given what they were doing, that was the right theoretical tool to develop. Other firms, it's resource-based theory. Other firms, agency theory or transaction costs. The core question that Ronald Coase asked is a question that almost no managers ever think of, which is, why did you bring this exchange inside the firm instead of just using the market? And it's like, you just ask that question, and people go, well, it never even occurred to me that we would not do this ourselves. Listen, well, why would you? I mean, clearly there are people out there who are really good at it. Can you not write a contract?
Not invented here syndrome, right? You see that?
No, it's a social problem. It's not an economic. And so when you put a little economic spin on it, they say, well, it's kind of embarrassing, but we did this because someone really wanted to do it. He really wanted it in-house because it made his business bigger. And then we say, okay, well, that's an agency problem. So you listen to the language that's being used by the manager, and then we have to be able to do the translation. They're not going to do that. They don't know the theories well enough. I don't expect them to. But we can do the translation and ask them questions that you and I take for granted that they have never thought of. And that is, the question itself is value adding for them. And then we can guide them in getting answers as well. So so it's not organized in a hierarchy. It's not like a checklist. And do a resource-based analysis that requests. Let's imagine that we could come up with a checklist that allows you to apply these theories in a very systematic way and know exactly what strategy you should pursue. Would that checklist itself be a source of sustained competitive advantage?
Right.
The answer is no. Okay.
No. Unless, except for you and me, might be able to sell it.
We could sell it. No, that's right. But so let's get off this and we'll figure out how we can sell it. So the trick is, it's always going to be judgment and oriented under uncertainty with lots of variables I don't know. I will say this with boldness. When I work with clients, they clearly know more about their firm and their industry than I will ever know. But I got the theories. Okay.
Well, look, last question. I want to ask you about culture because it seems like you kind of, you started off, I think, doing sociology, right, at some point, and then
I was my original degree was a joint degree in sociology and business there.
Right, but then you kind of drifted away, and then I think kind of went back to culture sort of later and realized the importance of it as a source of competitive advantage, and I think now we probably have a need for I don't know, cultural studies, cultural science, cultural engineering as a discipline, because it's becoming increasingly important as a differentiator.
Sure.
So how did you come to realize the importance of culture, and how do you see that field developing? I mean, do you see this as a sub branch of strategy, right? Strategic cultural, studies or whatever, or is this like worthy of something distinct from say OB?
I'm sure you know that you have probably the best culture studies group in the world at Berkeley, right? You know that, right? So, those people know what they're doing. Okay. So for me personally, I wrote a paper in 1986, actually, on culture and sustained competitive advantage, published in AMR. And basically, it took resource-based theory and said, yes, it can be a source of sustained competitive advantage. Yeah. And so, but that was like a one-off. But I have, in my work with companies, as I said earlier, choosing the strategy is not the hard problem, it's implementation. And in the 80s, I was doing a lot of work with Hewlett-Packard Corporation. And at the time, I can say nothing about HP now, but at the time, they were culturally an amazing company, very enabling, supportive, very demanding. The performance expectations were very, very high, but it was really a great place to learn. And I was called up by one of HP's competitors that will go unnamed, and they said, Professor Barney, we understand that you know a lot about HP's culture. I says, yes. Well, we just completed a 6-month study of our culture, and it turns out that our culture is risk averse. Think about that for a second. 6-month study to discover their culture. And everyone in the Valley knew that they were risk averse. Everyone knew. So this is like a 3-minute conversation, but 6 months later. And I said, what we want to do is we want to hire you to help us get rid of our old culture and then build a new culture just like HP's. And we want to do that in 6 weeks. And I thought that was absurd on its face. But I had to admit to myself, I don't know how to do that. Now, by the way, my counsel to them was, you should try to go into businesses that don't require a culture like HP. Use your culture with its risk aversion and control orientation to go into more commodity-like businesses, for example. Anyway, where innovation is not that important. So from the very beginning, from my early days, I knew that culture was important, but I couldn't articulate a theory of how to change a culture, and whatever theory I knew was not going to be easy. And so that was always in the back burner for me, and not as a sociologist, but as a strategy person, that culture was important. And then I got a new neighbor. I live in Park City, Utah, and one of the advantages of living in Park City is that people move there from all over the world, and they're often very interesting people. And this guy turns out is a 4-time CEO, board member, entrepreneur, blah, blah, blah. So I say, hey, let's have lunch together. And so I scheduled an hour for lunch, and 4 hours later, we had debriefed his entire career. And it turns out that what he specialized in was culture change. I mean, actually, as an operator, he was pretty good. I'm not saying he was a bad CEO on those dimensions, but what made him distinctive was his ability to change organizational culture. And in the process of describing his career, I was able to describe it back to him in theoretical terms about how he actually was changing his culture. And so I said, we need to write this book, because this is a question I've had since 1986, roughly. And so he agreed. And so we ended up, and it was a perfect COVID project. So we interviewed 70 CEOs over Zoom. And now part of this process, I did what the academic does. I did a literature review on theories of organizational change. And to a large extent, those theories are very skeptical about the ability to change culture. And so they're not useful. I mean, one of them is you can do this on this and do this and this and then wait for 10 years and the culture will change. Well, people have 10 years. I mean, that's ridiculous. Right. So I didn't find the received literature particularly helpful, which is, that's great for me, because then I could then fill in those blanks. And chapter 2 in the book is it's not a heavy duty theory change. I mean, a theory of organizational change. Don't pretend to be a change scholar, but it's a slightly different take on it. And then we studied it empirically, which is something I almost never do. And that's how it came. And it turns out it was the book is actually fun to read. It's basically 52 stories of using stories, changing stories, creating stories to create culture change. And the stories are fun, are energizing, moving even. And the heroes in our book are these CEOs who do these incredible things to change culture. And not everyone's successful. Some it's painfully obvious why they're not successful, but and others just try hard and just don't work. But we have enough success stories that we are pretty confident about our results. So that's how we got to it. It was always been there. I'm not like returning to sociology. So I'm too much of an economist to be a sociologist, but that way I was just at a meeting just here in France recently where these sociologists were talking about the role of power and how important it is. And I'm not denying that's important phenomena, but I'm an efficiency guy. I'm much more interested in how markets generate efficiency over time. And so I'm too much an efficient capital markets guy, too much of a competition guy. too much of a efficiency guy to be a sociologist. Although I read their work and find it interesting, but that's not what I do.
Yeah. In any event, that highly recommend that book on culture. It's fantastic. And Jay, it's been great chatting. Hopefully we can chat again soon. We'll come up. I'm sure we can find an excuse to do so. And hopefully
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.